I always thought my life by the lake would be quiet, slow, and shaped by sunrises over still water, but that illusion shattered the moment the association's envelope slid under my door like it was smuggling trouble. The whole thing started with a single question burning in my chest: could a neighbor's whispered tip really trigger a $1,000 penalty before Friday? The board made it sound like the countdown had already begun, and I swear I felt that timer ticking behind every page I turned. The letter felt heavier than it should, as if each folded sheet carried the weight of someone else's power trip. The first line announced a violation involving rain barrels. Mine. Hidden behind the hydrangeas, tucked neatly along the backside of my lake house, invisible unless someone had leaned into my yard without being invited. The wind outside brushed against the wooden siding with this slow, restless hush, like it sensed something was shifting. The board claimed an anonymous report had identified unauthorized water collection devices, which already made my pulse spike. Out here, most of us tried to keep our lawns healthy without wasting thousands of gallons. Those barrels helped keep my garden alive through dry spells and gave me a bit of independence. That's probably what annoyed them most. Independence always bothered people who liked rules more than neighbors. The letter set a deadline, July 1st. Remove the barrels or face compounding penalties. The threat of fines rolled right off the page, sharp and impatient. Somewhere between the lines, I felt that familiar heat of injustice start to simmer, that spark of petty defiance that always wakes up when power gets misused. I didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of the messiest HOA nightmare I'd ever walked into. And as I stood in my kitchen reading that notice, something in me whispered that I wasn't going to let this go quietly. The stakes weren't just money. They were about principle. Boundaries. Autonomy. That theme, the pressure of someone else trying to box me in, would follow every twist of what happened next. And yeah, I wasn't planning to lose. Before this chaos, life at the lake had a rhythm. Morning coffee on the deck. The faint call of birds waking in the trees. The shimmer of sunlight on water like broken glass spread across a table. I moved here because the world felt too loud everywhere else, and this place promised calm. For a long time, it actually delivered. Our board, on paper, was supposed to keep the community tidy and safe. In reality, it had slowly morphed into the kind of committee that treated every shrub, trash bin, and paint color like matters of national security. And the biggest enforcer of that attitude was my neighbor, the infamous watcher of our road. A classic overseer type who loved rules almost as much as she loved inspecting other people's yards. A walking, talking piece of Karen neighbor drama wrapped in pastel sweaters and suspicion. She had a habit. Peering. Hovering. Standing in her yard like she was waiting for someone to slip up so she could pounce with a report. I caught her glancing toward my hydrangeas more than once, her eyes squinting like they were tiny surveillance cameras. She always pretended she was checking on her roses, but her roses never seemed to require her attention unless someone nearby was doing yard work. And then there was the association binder. An overstuffed relic filled with rules rewritten too many times to track. Some pages were clear. Most were vague. A few contradicted each other in ways so messy they probably canceled themselves out. Somewhere buried in that pile was the truth about rain barrels. I just didn't know what it was yet. The letter I received wasn't detailed, which made it worse. It didn't cite the full rule. It didn't describe the violation beyond calling the barrels unauthorized. It didn't even mention the number of barrels they supposedly saw. That vagueness was intentional. It was a power move, one meant to scare me into immediate compliance. As the breeze pushed at my windows and the light dimmed behind a cloud, I felt the urge to sit down and trace this issue back to its roots. I needed to understand how something as harmless as rainwater had turned into a battlefield. And more importantly, who started this fight. I wasn't prepared for how deep it would go. The first thing I did was walk outside, circle around to the back of my property, and stare at the barrels like they had betrayed me. For dark green containers lined neatly against the siding, positioned to collect runoff from the downspout. They were discreet, quiet, self-contained. Not an eyesore. Not dangerous. Not breaking any moral code of the universe. So how exactly did these become the focus of the committee's wrath? The hydrangeas rustled lightly in a gust of wind, petals brushing each other with a whisper. For a split second, I imagined those bushes witnessing the moment someone crept up close enough to spot the barrels. Whoever reported them didn't see them by accident. They had to look intentionally. That was my first clue. Inside, I pulled out the old binder of association rules. Mine was marked up with notes from years of community meetings where half the time we argued over things like mailbox heights or lawn ornament restrictions. As I flipped through, I spotted an evidence prop I'd once tucked into the pages, a board agenda excerpt from last fall. It mentioned a proposed revision about water-related exterior devices. The board tabled the discussion back then, unsure they had the authority to regulate what they called eco-collection practices. Which meant they never approved any final rule. I read deeper. Some bylaws allowed temporary rain capture systems as long as they weren't visible from the street. Mine weren't. Others mentioned coverings and color standards. I had followed those too. Nothing I saw suggested my barrels were banned. If anything, the confusion made it obvious that the association loved loopholes almost as much as they loved paperwork. That's when I remembered something the treasurer once said during a meeting. They'd offhandedly complained that certain residents were courting water, which could alter the aesthetic balance of the neighborhood. Meaning, they wanted uniform gardens, not self-sufficient ones. The idea of independence bothered them. It messed with their curated look. As I kept reading, tension built under my skin. The deeper I went, the more it became clear that someone, probably the board's favorite informant, had stirred this up without any solid rule to stand on. That meant they were bluffing. But bluffing could still cost me $1,000 if I didn't act fast. That's when my determination sharpened into something clearer. I needed to know exactly what deadline I was facing, and how I could turn it back on them. The official notice letter sat on my table like a threat dressed as stationery. Printed at the top, just beneath the header, was something that made my stomach tighten, the notice date, stamped cleanly as July 1st. That alone was odd. Why would they date a letter for July 1st when I received it on June 27th? That meant either someone backdated it, or the board wanted to pretend the violation had been logged earlier than it actually was. Both were shady. Both gave me leverage. And both hinted that someone was in a rush to pin this on me before the holiday weekend. This wasn't just a rules issue. It was a power play. I reread the letter carefully, running my finger along each stiff line. They referenced a bylaw. Bylaw 12.3. A short clause I couldn't remember ever seeing enforced. Something about exterior structures or modifications that alter drainage expectations. That language was vague on purpose, written in a way that could apply to anything from a rain barrel to a child's inflatable pool. But vague rules cut both ways. The lake shimmered through the window. The sound of a small boat humming faintly across the water filled the air for a moment, a sensory reminder that life beyond this drama kept moving even when the board wanted everything frozen under their control. I leaned back in my chair and felt the familiar fire of defiance spark to life. I wasn't going to let them bully me into giving up my water barrels based on a rule they barely understood themselves. And I certainly wasn't going to let a neighbor's petty spying turn into financial punishment. But the clock was running. And the penalties were real. If I didn't find a loophole fast, the board could slap me with $1,000 fine before the weekend even ended. And that looming threat pushed me to dig even deeper, especially since I knew someone nearby was counting on me to fold quickly. I wasn't planning on folding. By the 9-minute mark, I had gathered every piece of paper I could find that referenced bylaw revisions, addendums, or meeting minutes. I created piles on my table, sorting pages by date, category, and any mention of drainage. The binder creaked every time I flipped through another section, like it was tired of being used as a weapon in this ongoing feud. That's when I found something big. A revision draft, never approved, suggesting that Bylaw 12.3 required a majority vote to enforce additional drainage rules. A vote that never happened. Which meant the board was enforcing a rule that technically had no teeth. This discovery hit me like a jolt. My heart thudded fast. I had found the loose thread. If I pulled it right, the whole case against me could unravel. A cloud passed over the sun outside, dimming the kitchen for a moment as if the house itself was holding its breath. My mind raced with possibilities. A loophole this clean meant the association didn't have authority to demand removal under Bylaw 12.3. They were relying on me being too overwhelmed or intimidated to question them. But before I could celebrate, I needed to verify one thing: my property deed. It wasn't just a record of ownership. It was the one document that spelled out exactly which bylaws applied when my house was built, and which versions of rules had legal standing. If my deed referenced an older set of bylaws that didn't include the ambiguous clause they cited, then my barrels weren't just allowed, they were grandfathered in. And if they were grandfathered in, then I had more protection than the board realized. I stood up, taking one last look at the piles of papers spread across my table. This battle wasn't just about rain barrels anymore. It was about proving that someone's attempt to control my space would backfire spectacularly. And I was ready to flip the script. The next step felt heavy but necessary. I went to the hallway closet where my closing papers were stored in an old metal lockbox. Every time the hinges squeaked, it reminded me of how long I'd owned this place, how many seasons had passed since I'd first unlocked this front door. The lake house wasn't just a building, it was a decade of roots I'd put down. Roots the association was now threatening because someone disliked the look of 4 discrete barrels. When I lifted the lockbox onto the table, a faint creak echoed through the quiet kitchen. Outside, a branch tapped gently against the window, like it was nudging me toward what came next. I sifted through manila folders until I found the one labeled Deed Plus Governing Docs. The pages smelled faintly like cardboard and time. Inside the packet, I found the key, a reference sheet from when the property transferred to me. It listed the bylaws in effect at that time. I scanned the page until I found what I was looking for. Bylaw 12.3 wasn't listed. Not in any form. Not even as a pending addition. That meant any changes they made after the transfer weren't automatically enforceable unless the board followed specific revision procedures, and I already knew they hadn't. This wasn't just a loophole. It was a shield. As that realization crystallized, a bit of the pressure around my ribs loosened. I wasn't powerless. My barrels weren't in violation. And the association was leaning on a clause that had no binding relationship to my property at all. But this wasn't the moment to get smug. Not yet. Because if the board was willing to issue an ultimatum dated July 1st before I even saw it, they weren't going to back down easily. They had momentum behind them. And someone, my very nosy neighbor, was feeding them fuel. They'd push. They'd escalate. And they'd expect me to give up before they hit their limit. They didn't know me well. The association had weaponized deadlines. But I had facts. Evidence props that stacked neatly into a story they didn't want told. The board agenda excerpt. The unapproved revision draft. The deed's reference sheet. 3 solid anchors proving their enforcement was on shaky ground. The question now was how to use the Section 3 wasn't finished with me yet. Conflict has a way of stretching itself, reaching new corners you don't expect. As I examined the deed packet in the quiet kitchen, the sound of a distant lawnmower drifted through the open window, steady, mechanical, grounding. It reminded me that while I was preparing for a paper war, the rest of the neighborhood was buzzing with summer routines. Meanwhile, I was tracing the outlines of a battle brewing in my own home. The board didn't just want compliance, they wanted control. And that theme, abuse of authority, hovered over every step they took. I could almost picture my neighbor standing behind her curtains, waiting to see whether her report had triggered the result she wanted. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. The letter's wording replayed in my mind. Phrases like lack of transparency and failure to uphold community standards. Those weren't accusations. They were rehearsed lines. Someone had pushed for this. Someone had insisted on making an example out of me. And I intended to make an example out of them instead, politely, methodically, and publicly. I needed more information. More ammunition. So I reviewed the association guidelines again, focusing on enforcement procedures. That's when I spotted another detail that tightened everything into focus: the mailbox rule. It appeared in an older section of the CCRs, something most residents forgot existed. It stated that notice timelines didn't begin until the recipient actually received the mailed document. And while the board hand-delivered mine, they had dated it as though they mailed it. That inconsistency mattered. If they wanted to find me by Friday, they were counting on the July 1st date sticking. But the mailbox rule threw a wrench into their whole argument, because delivery on June 27th meant their timeline was off by days. This wasn't just a loophole. It was a pattern of sloppiness. I made a note. Evidence prop number 4, CCR section 4.3 mailbox rule. Another piece of the puzzle. As all the paperwork formed a fortress around me, something deeper clicked into place. The board didn't expect anyone to read this thoroughly. They relied on confusion, on residents giving up, on silence. But silence wasn't on my agenda. If I didn't step carefully, the association could still force hundreds, if not thousands, of dollars onto my ledger with just a rubber-stamped meeting. And the thought of paying a single cent for a trumped-up violation made my blood simmer. So I doubled down on my mission to dismantle their argument before they even had a chance to present it. This fight wasn't just about beating the deadline. It was about making sure no other homeowner got steamrolled by someone else's power trip. The escalation started 2 days later, early enough on a humid morning that the air felt thick when I stepped outside. The sun was just beginning to rise, washing the lakefront in pale gold. You would think the board might leave me alone for a minute. But no. They escalated like they were sprinting toward confrontation. A new notice appeared taped to my front door. Not slipped under it like the last. Taped. Bold. Visible. The kind meant to shame rather than inform. My stomach dipped. The header announced, "Second notice, immediate attention required." The words were printed in all caps, as if yelling through paper. And this time they added a line that made my pulse tighten: pending inspection scheduled for July 3rd. They wanted to come onto my property. They wanted to check the barrels. They wanted to catch me in supposed non-compliance. Sunlight glinted off the lake behind my house as I read the letter, the shimmer bending into fractured brightness. For a moment, anger pulsed through me. Not fear. Anger. This wasn't procedure. This was aggression. The letter warned that failure to comply could result in escalating fines, beginning with $250 and rising to $1,000. They also claimed I had already exceeded the grace period. Convenient, considering they had predated their first notice. I took the paper inside and placed it beside the stack on my table. And then I noticed something: the bylaw reference had changed. Now they weren't citing Bylaw 12.3. They were citing Section 8.9, a catch-all clause about unapproved exterior alterations. That was a red flag. When an HOA changes the rule they're accusing you of breaking, it means they're scrambling. Covering gaps. Or worse, trying to overwhelm you with noise so you back down. I didn't back down. I returned to the deed packet. That document saved me once, and it was about to save me again. Section 8.9 didn't apply to rain barrels. It applied to permanent modifications. Structures. Additions. Visual alterations visible from the street. My barrels were none of those things. But the escalation didn't end with a new notice. Around noon, as the day brightened, I caught a glimpse of my neighbor again. She was pretending to reset her sprinklers, but she kept glancing at the back of my house where the barrels sat. Her posture was stiff, expectant. Like she wanted confirmation that she had set something in motion. She had. But not the outcome she imagined. The board pushed harder that afternoon. A mass email went out to the community, thinly veiled, but unmistakably about me. It highlighted ongoing drainage concerns, implying that an unnamed resident was altering runoff patterns and contributing to erosion risks along the lakeside path. That was a bold lie. No one from the board had inspected my property. No one had reviewed runoff behavior. They were using fear to justify their control. The email carried an edge of social shame, hinting that whoever was responsible for these risks needed to reconsider their choices for the good of the community. It made my jaw clench. This was the kind of public pressure tactic the association loved, turning neighbors against one another. They counted on whispers traveling faster than truth. But I wasn't about to let them rewrite my story. Their attempt to drag me through the mud only fueled my resolve. If they wanted to make me the villain of their narrative, I would make sure my receipts told a different story, one the whole community would see when the time came. Late that evening, as the sky turned a deep violet over the water, I sat at my table analyzing every scrap of documentation. I needed to be ready. Because when July 3rd arrived, the board would try to corner me. They would show up expecting to win. The question was how to prepare the strike that would dismantle their argument before they even finished their opening sentence. The answer arrived in the form of another evidence prop I didn't expect to find, a final notice dated May 12 tucked between older meeting notes. It referenced a different residence case and outlined the required steps the board had to follow before issuing penalties. Steps they skipped entirely with me. My breath caught in my chest. They violated their own process. They had established precedent. And then they had ignored it. This discovery didn't just help my case. It demolished theirs. The quiet of the house magnified every thought racing through my mind. Outside, the sound of crickets buzzed across the yard, a soft reminder that nighttime had settled in. But I wasn't tired. Not even close. I opened a fresh folder and began assembling my defense. More than that, I was building the blueprint of my retaliation. Not malicious. Not vindictive. Just precise. Measured. Designed to send a message: homeowners weren't helpless. By the time I sorted everything, my plan had formed. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. But it was bulletproof. Step 1. Gather every document showing inconsistencies. Step 2. Print the deed reference sheet showing older bylaws applied. Step 3. Highlight the unapproved revision draft. Step 4. Emphasize CCR Section 4.3 mailbox rule. Step 5. Compile the association's own precedent from May 12. Step 6. Prepare a point-by-point rebuttal for inspection day. But that was only Phase 1. Because Phase 2. That would turn everything they tried to weaponize against me into the public compliance twist I hinted at in Module 1. And it was almost time to set it in motion. At this point, the board had fired off multiple notices, shifted rule citations, and scheduled a surprise inspection. I had uncovered evidence proving they never approved the governing rule and ignored their own enforcement procedures. And they had no idea I was ready to use every piece of it. But before the climax, escalation still had one more layer to stack onto this growing mountain of chaos. On July 2nd, the day before the inspection, I received a community-wide bulletin slipped into everyone's mailboxes. A small folded sheet filled with urgent language: environmental concerns, lake preservation, drainage hazards. They claimed anonymous complaints were rising. That improper water collection devices created neighborhood-wide issues. And that residents failing to comply should expect strict enforcement. The fearmongering was shameless. But the timing, perfect. Suspiciously perfect. It was released exactly 24 hours before they planned to show up at my house. It framed me as the problem before giving me a chance to speak. It primed the community to side with the association. Fine. If they wanted an audience, they were going to get one. Just not the performance they rehearsed. The next morning was thick with humidity. Clouds hung low across the lake, casting dark ripples along the surface. The air carried the heavy scent of rain waiting just out of reach. Even nature felt like it was hovering on the edge of something. Inspection day. I woke early, set the table with every piece of documentation I'd gathered, and then took a long look at the barrels out back. They sat exactly where they always had, tidy, clean, unobtrusive. If anything, they looked peaceful. Ordinary. Yet somehow, they had ignited the biggest storm I'd faced in my years at the lake. When the association weaponizes aesthetics, peace can become evidence. My plan for the inspection wasn't confrontational. It wasn't emotional. It relied on the thing bullies hate most, calm accuracy. Facts. Receipts. The quiet certainty of knowing the truth was on my side. But the twist I had in store? That would come later. Right now, I needed to survive the escalation phase without giving the board an inch. And I needed to set the stage for what I'd do next. Because Section 5, retaliation, was coming fast. And I intended to start it with impact. They thought the inspection would corner me. They had no idea it would become the moment I turned the entire case around, and set up the most public, most ironic compliance they had ever witnessed. The countdown wasn't mine anymore. It was theirs. As I heard footsteps approaching the front porch, I inhaled slowly, steadying myself. Rain clouds shifted overhead, muting the morning light into a soft gray. The air vibrated with anticipation. The board expected an easy win. But I was done playing defense. And the moment I opened the door, the real battle began. The moment I opened the door, the air shifted. The board's inspection team stood on my porch in a tight formation, as if they were arriving to audit a skyscraper instead of visiting a quiet lake house with a modest garden. Their clipboards gleamed in the muted morning light, catching a faint reflection of the gray sky above. The treasurer stood in front, wearing the same expression people use when they think they've already won. Behind them, my neighbor, yes, the same one who had started all of this, hovered at the property line, pretending she was checking her mailbox, even though she held no letters. Her posture was rigid. Expectant. She wanted a spectacle. She was going to get one. Just not the kind she imagined. I stepped aside, granting the board entry, my heart steady and ready. They commented that they were here to verify ongoing violations. Their tone carried that manufactured authority the association liked to wield. I kept my expression calm, neutral, inviting them to follow. Inside, my dining table was transformed into a battlefield of documentation. Stacks of papers. Highlighted bylaws. The deed reference sheet. The mailbox rule. The board agenda excerpt. The revision draft. The final notice dated May 12th. Not messy, just purposeful. A silent lineup of truths. Their postures shifted the moment they saw it. Inspection day was no longer their stage. It was mine. I gestured for them to sit, and instead of resisting, they complied. That single action told me everything. They were cautious. Afraid to misstep. Unsure if their footing was as solid as they wanted the neighborhood to believe. Good. That hesitation was the opening I needed. The sound of distant waves brushing the shoreline drifted faintly through the window, a soft, rhythmic reminder that nature itself was on its own schedule, unbothered by community politics. It grounded me as the confrontation began. I began with steady logic, laying out the paperwork one item at a time. I paraphrased notes from the association's own governing documents, not asking questions but presenting facts. They were expecting emotion. They got structure instead. First, I placed the deed reference sheet in front of them. It identified the bylaws in effect when the house transferred to me, bylaws that did not include the clause they had first cited. Their faces tightened. The treasurer shifted in his chair. Second, I slid forward the unapproved revision draft of Bylaw 12.3, the one they tried to enforce despite lacking any record of a formal vote. I pointed to the margin notes describing the clause as pending review. Their eyes moved quickly across the page. Third, I highlighted the CCR Section 4.3 mailbox rule. I paraphrased the language that timelines begin upon receipt, not issuance. Since they hand-delivered the notice dated July 1st on June 27th, their entire penalty schedule was invalid. Fourth, I presented the final notice dated May 12th from another resident's case detailing the mandatory steps required before fines could be issued. They had skipped several. Fifth, I pointed to the board agenda excerpt discussing water-related practices and the tabled revisions from last fall, another sign that ambiguity existed, and they were exploiting it. The treasurer finally spoke, trying to phrase their actions as good faith efforts. But the inconsistencies stacked too high for that defense. They knew it. I knew it. The lake wind whistled faintly through a small gap in the window frame, adding a subtle tension to the silence that followed. It felt like the house itself was waiting for the next move. If they continued to push illegal enforcement, the association risked being exposed for violating its own procedures, something no board wants becoming public knowledge. And I wasn't bluffing. I had the documentation to follow through. I then invited them to conduct the outdoor inspection. They hesitated. But they followed. Out back, the barrels sat quietly against the siding. Clean. Covered. Painted to match the house's exterior. Hidden from street view. Exactly compliant with the original bylaw standards I inherited with the property. The board scribbled notes, trying to mask their discomfort. My neighbor edged closer, pretending to deadhead her flowers. Her disappointment was almost visible. As the board reconvened on my porch to review findings, I returned inside, retrieved the last piece of documentation I needed, and prepared for the turning point. This moment, subtle as it looked from the outside, marked the shift from conflict to retaliation. Not spiteful retaliation, measured retaliation. The kind rooted in truth, not theatrics. I thanked them for visiting and informed them, again paraphrasing, that I would be submitting a full written response by the end of the day, complete with attachments. They nodded stiffly, likely assuming this would be a simple rebuttal. It wasn't. When they left, my neighbor tried to linger nearby, expecting a reaction. She didn't get one. I simply walked back inside, shut the door gently, and felt the atmosphere shift into resolve. The retaliation plan was ready. I spent the next 2 hours preparing a meticulous, time-stamped packet. Everything organized, labeled, and cross-referenced. It wasn't just a defense. It was a mirror held up to the board's mistakes. And then came the move they never anticipated. The association loved visibility. They made my case visible to the neighborhood without naming me. So I used visibility right back, tastefully, legally, and with a twist that would become the talk of the community long after. My idea was simple. If the association insisted my rain barrels required compliance adjustments, then I would comply, publicly, in a way that revealed how baseless their demands actually were. But I needed one more step before the reveal. I filed a request to attend the next community meeting. Not privately. Publicly. Through the shared bulletin board system they themselves used for announcements. I posted a short note stating I would be addressing a procedural concern related to drainage policy interpretation. That single sentence made ripples. Some neighbors reached out asking what happened. Some whispered curiosity. Some wondered who the email about drainage hazards had been targeting. The association realized too late that the narrative was slipping from their hands. The day before the meeting, I prepared the piece de resistance of my compliance twist. I repainted the barrels in a tasteful, house-matching shade, again. Not because I had to, but because it reinforced how benign they were. Then I added decorative lattice panels in front of them, anchored cleanly into the soil, fully removable, perfectly within the old bylaw. Visible? No. Obtrusive? No. Against guidelines? Absolutely not. My compliance was flawless. Painfully flawless. Embarrassingly flawless. Anyone paying attention would realize the entire conflict had been built on overreach. And that was the point. When the association tried to control me, they forgot one thing: people watch the board more closely when they overstep. And now the board's attempt to fix the barrels had turned into an accidental spotlight on themselves. Yes. The evening of the meeting arrived under low clouds and a stillness that felt like the lake was holding its breath. I entered the clubhouse with my packet tucked under my arm, my expression calm and neutral. The board members sat at the front, their faces stiff. Several neighbors filled the seats. Even my overly curious neighbor settled in with the eagerness of someone expecting a spectacle. She wasn't wrong. After the roll call, I requested the floor. The treasurer granted it reluctantly. I placed my packet on the front table and began laying out the sequence step by step. The predated notice. The illegal enforcement of an unapproved bylaw. The mailbox rule violation. The shift in accusations. The skipped procedural steps clearly evidenced by the May 12 precedent. The documented proof that my rain barrels were compliant from day one. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply revealed. Paragraph by paragraph. Receipt by receipt. A brief pause settled over the room as I finished. One of those thin, breath-held pauses that hangs right before a storm changes direction. Then, with deliberate timing, I added my final point. That due to the association's misapplication of rules, I had incurred unnecessary stress, misinformation had circulated in the community, and the board's handling reflected a lack of due diligence. No threats. No demands. Just truth. And then I delivered the twist. I informed the room that I had complied fully with the guidelines as written in the original bylaws, citing dated photographs and the fresh lattice screening, and that my compliance was complete, photographed, and logged. A compliance twist that proved I had never been the problem. The room shifted. People murmured. Eyes darted toward board members now avoiding eye contact. My neighbor looked like her favorite TV show had suddenly been cancelled mid-season. The treasurer cleared his throat and suggested they review the material. But the damage was done. The community now understood the association had acted without solid ground. And the board knew it. The fallout began almost immediately. The board stumbled through the remainder of the meeting. Neighbors whispered, connecting dots. Some applauded my thoroughness afterward. Others expressed quiet relief. Many had long felt the board pushed too hard but lacked proof. I left the meeting slowly, feeling the cool evening air brush against my arms as crickets hummed along the lakeshore. The whole world felt lighter, as if the weight of the association's scrutiny had finally cracked and fallen away. The board didn't apologize publicly. They never do. But I received a short letter 2 days later stating that no further action would be taken at this time. Sanitized language for surrender. The rain barrels stayed. And so did my backbone. Life returned to its rhythm after that. The lake regained its calm presence. Mornings felt lighter with the garden thriving again. The hydrangeas bloomed deeper shades of blue under the steady supply of rainwater. Sometimes I caught my neighbor watching but never approaching. The power she thought she had evaporated with the truth. The association grew noticeably quieter. Notices became rare. Guidelines became clearer. Meetings became less performative and more procedural. The board learned, in its own uncomfortable way, that oversight has limits. I didn't become a rebel or neighborhood legend. I just became someone who refused to let power go unchecked. Someone who proved that rules, when used correctly, protect, not punish. And whenever I pass the barrels, tucked behind the lattice, I remember that standing your ground isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. Calm. Surgical. Steady. And deeply satisfying. Tell me your HOA horror in one line, I'm ready for the next chapter.